Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this afternoon's session on more bang for your bucks. I'm Valerie Archibald. I'm Head of Finance Skills at the National School of Government. If you don't remember the National School of Government, you might remember the Civil Service College. We've morphed along the years, and that's the organisation we are. And I'm involved in looking after finance training for all sorts of people, large groups and small, open courses, tailored courses for departments, occasionally running courses for ministers. And to keep my skills in, because I've been at National School a long time, I also help very small departments keep their finance systems up to date, improve their information. When we started designing this session, we took the information that we at the National School knew about how things might work. We spoke to the Treasury, and we've been consulting the Treasury constantly, obviously, as the spending review guidance has been coming out. And we also went out to departments to ask them what practical experience they'd got about how to manage their money better. And to help me in this session this afternoon, I'm very pleased to have with me Robert Arnott, Head of Value for Money Productivity at Home Office, who's going to take you through the practical side of what work they did in order to improve things. One thing I do know from over 25 years of running anything to do with training sessions on finance, particularly this late in the afternoon, is you may well fall asleep. So that's where, on your seats, you will find the yellow sheet. Because what we're going to do is not just have input from us at the front, but actually have a practical case study running through the session. And here, we're going to get you to work with your neighbours. So if you're not sitting next to somebody, look in either direction, work out which one looks better, and move along to join them. Because before we start anything in terms of what we're talking about, I'd like you to look at an area of spend that most of us are familiar with, which is the area of spending money on travel and subsistence, or you may call it expenses, in your bit of government. Could I just ask for a quick show of hands? How many of you will be claiming some travel and subsistence expenses as a result of your visit to Civil Service Live today? All right, so quite a lot of us are involved in this area of spending. So what I'd like you to do right now is tackle question number 1 on here. Okay? We want you to look at, imagine you're in charge of a scrutiny of T&S in your organisation, and with your neighbour, decide what sort of questions you'd like to ask to see if what you're spending your money on is a good thing. 3 minutes on this before we move on to the next bit. Right, let us pause there. I hope besides getting some ideas down, you've perhaps got an idea of who's sitting next to you as well. What would help both me and Robert is to have a little feel about who might be in the room. I mean, I could go on the database and find out, but you've probably all swapped rooms. Half of you are sitting in here, so make sure you get a good seat for the final session. I appreciate that one. Could I have a show of hands, which maybe not very many, if you actually work in the finance function within organisations? Okay, thank you. Quick show of hands if you're in any way involved, and it could be some of the same people, any way involved in the spending review that's taking place at the moment. Thank you. And final show of hands, brave people this time, do you work for the Treasury? Just a few. Okay. Just trying to work out how polite I need to be. All right. Okay, we're going to take that T&S study further. That's why you've only got question 1 on the sheet. We'll give you the other 3 questions as we get to the right point. But what I want to do is now take you through some of the background that we need to look at when we're working about how we're going to get more bang for our bucks. And apologies for this if you know this diagram well. If you haven't seen it before, I will take you through it very briefly. We're English, so we read, British, we read from left to right. Okay, so we start at the left-hand side of this diagram. We have money that we put into our systems, and we all know that that money that's going in could be a lot less, will be a lot less fairly soon. What we do with that money is buy inputs. Now, inputs are a bit jargonish, but we need people. We mean buildings. We mean equipment. That's what we're talking about with inputs. We then carry out various activities in our organisations, and those deliver outputs, and that's what our organisations deliver to the public. Okay? So an output could be a child being educated, it could be a hospital with patients being treated, it could be frontline police forces, it could be defence. Those are the outputs. Right over the right-hand side, we have the outcomes. As a result of our outputs, something happens to the nation, hopefully something better. For some of you, if you're in DFID or if you're in Foreign Commonwealth Office, it may be actually having an impact on the whole world, not just on what's going on in this country. Those are outcomes at the right-hand end. And obviously, this is what we're trying to achieve with the money. So this is the bangs at this end of the equation, and the very left-hand end of the equation are the bucks that are going into this process. And in terms of what we do when we're looking at what's going on and how we're going to improve what's here, you're probably aware of the 3 E's. Our first E is economy, and that's the way we look at getting the inputs we need at as low a cost as possible. So we spend as least as possible on our office accommodation, on our people. We procure collectively, corporately, so we get economies of scale in terms of procurement. There's all sorts of things we do in terms of economy. Getting over to the outputs is where we've got measures of our efficiency. So are we really good at turning our inputs into lots of outputs, or are we relatively inefficient? This event that's happening right now is quite good in turning inputs, which is myself and Robert's time, into outputs, which is you all understanding things. Well, you've been told about things. The outcomes I'm less sure about, because the last stage in this process is effectiveness. Most of us can be very efficient, but sometimes we're not very effective. There's always a trade-off between them. And what we're talking about in terms of getting value for money is right the way over the whole length of the chain, going from the inputs, the bangs, right way through to the outcomes, the bucks. And in terms of improving value for money, we're looking at each of those stages there. National Audit Office defines the 3 E's this way. So this is their way of saying economy, we end up spending less money. Efficiency, the money we spend is spent well. Effectiveness, we actually get the right things out. We spend it wisely. Now, many of you may think this is a job for the Perm Sec. They're the accounting officer, or it's your chief executive if you're an agency or an NDPB. They've got responsibility for value for money. Well, there's this thing called the Civil Service Code, which many of you have got a copy of tucked upstairs underneath your pillow, so you read it every night. Many of you may have never ever looked at it. But the Civil Service Code actually requires all of us, all civil servants, to make sure that we actually use public money, that's the bucks, and other resources, so that's the assets that we've already got, which we bought a few years ago. That's assets that we've got now, making sure we get the best out of those. And now the Coalition Programme for Government is actually repeating this and enhancing it by saying that there is going to be an obligation on all public servants to make sure that taxpayers' money is managed wisely. Now, Spending Review 2010. It's a busy slide. We'll give you, obviously, the slides are available later, but many of you will be aware that when we're actually looking at what it is we're intending to carry on into the future, we're not just slicing a little bit of money off everything. We're having a fairly fundamental review about what it is we're here to deliver. And there's these 9 key questions that we're looking at. The bits in black, the bold bits, are my emphasis in terms of what's required at each of the questions. So number 1, is it something that's essential to what's going on in government? Do we need in government to put any money into it? Is it got substantial economic value rather than just being, well, it's nice to have and it does give us a bit of money back, but actually maybe there's things that are higher priorities. Number 4, can we target it to those who need it most rather than giving it to everybody? We've already seen some changes there in the way that public spending is going on. How can we cut the cost in providing it? How can we do it more effectively? Can we get it delivered by someone outside central government? And if we're getting them to deliver it, can we make sure we pay them on results, not just on activity? And can we devolve it down to local bodies? So that's the questions we're being asked as part of the spending review for every programme in every department. And what this means for my diagram is we aren't starting at the left-hand side of this diagram anymore. We're starting at the right-hand side of the diagram. And we're saying, what outcomes do we want for the nation, for the world? Once we decide that, then we will track back along the equation and decide what it is we're actually going to have by way of outputs and then inputs and then budgets. Okay. Right. What I'd like to do now is for you and your nice neighbours to return to your yellow sheets. Question 2, having explained briefly what these 3 E's are, economy, efficiency and effectiveness, what I'd now like you to do is think about travel and subsistence and think about how you might apply those when you're looking at the money that's being spent. So again, 3 minutes on that with your neighbours. Right. Can I again get you to pause your ideas, make sure they are written down on someone's yellow piece of paper because they will be helpful. We'll move on to the next part of the process. If we want to know how we can cut the costs of what's going on, one of the key things we need to know as part of this process is how much a bang actually costs us. Right? Now, I'd like to point out the bang on this particular screen is a trident and therefore not subject to cut under SR10. It's the only one I could find that was relatively safe. Right? So we're going to have to look at this. And this, again, is part of what's going on in the spending review. Now, the next slide is going to be really tight, and only the accountants in the room will go, oh, yes, I know what that one is, but I'll take you through it. This is one of the key documents that's in a set of resource accounts. Each department produces them. We've done this since 1998. This document does what it says at the top. It's the statement of net operating costs by departmental strategic objectives. Now, I know we've just abolished DSOs and we're waiting for someone to replace them, but bear with me. We will replace them, whatever we replace them with, it's like there's going to be a document like this in a subsequent set of accounts. This particular statement happens to come from Department for Work and Pensions because they're getting through last 8, 9, because the 9, 10 ones aren't out yet, £143 billion. So that's a fifth of the total amount that's being spent in the public sector going through DWP. And what we've got in this document, and therefore we've got a similar document for all your departments and your agencies. If you're an agency, you'll be feeding into your parent department. DSO 1 to 5 for this particular financial year. So 5 strategic objectives for the Department for Work and Pensions and how much of their costs was going into each of those objectives. Now, the accountants in the room will know that this document has to be audited by the National Audit Office. The accountants in the room will also know that we're sometimes slightly carefully creative about how we get costs into the right objective. It's not a science, but once we've got a way of doing it, we can be consistent from year to year. But all this is doing is telling us the costs into objectives, not costs into outputs. And that's what we now have to do. So going back to my diagram earlier, costs going through to outcomes, one of the key things we've been asked to do in the spending review now is to come up with the unit cost of an output, which gets us from costs right the way over to outputs in the diagram. It doesn't get us all the way to outcomes, but it gets us a long way through. So we all know how much a bang costs. Here's some examples of unit costs. So the cost of keeping a prisoner in a prison or another establishment. How much it costs to keep, I'm sorry, I'm not metric into kilometres, so how much a mile of motorway costs, but obviously you've got a different number of lanes, so how much it costs to maintain those each year, assuming a certain state of repair. How much a hip replacement operation costs, how much it costs to give someone a passport, get someone into a job, educate someone through their primary education. Those are all output costs, unit costs of output. We're not doing unit costs of inputs. We're doing unit costs of outputs. Now, we don't know if that prisoner reoffends. We don't know if the motorways are having traffic flowing more smoothly up and down them with fewer accidents. We don't know if the person who has had the hip replacement operation lives a longer, healthier life. We're not measuring outcomes. We're measuring the outputs. Now, what we're doing in SR10 is the spend that goes on in your department, what's called your departmental expenditure limit, which is virtually all of the spend that you've got, apart from a few areas such as Social Security, which are in a different pot, but assume most of your spend is in Dell. We're looking at the resource cost. That's the cost for running your department and programs, not capital. Capital is being looked at separately in the spending review. And we're taking the resource Dell for your departments, carving it up into up to 5 areas, and then we're keeping admin separately to one side. And most of you know that admin is going to be subject to a reduction of 1/3 in the costs of the admin part of our departments. So once we've got our 5 areas, we need to come up with one key output for each of those areas, and then provide information where available in terms of the number of those going back to 2000 and forward to March 2015, which is the period covered by the spending review, and work out the unit costs thereof. And compare where there are comparisons to be made internationally, private sector, other parts of the public sector, perhaps even England comparing to Scotland, Wales, and whatever. As a result of that, we can do 2 things. We can use to spot trends. So if your unit cost starts at 100 and then goes up to 102, and then it goes up to 104, and then it goes up to 108, there's something going wrong. It's requiring us more inputs to deliver those outputs. So we can look at trends. We can also look at variance. If you tell the Treasury in the spending review that it's going to cost 100, and then, oops, it costs 105, there's a variance there that we need to talk about. Either your costs have gone up or you haven't got enough units going through. So again, we'll have information. That is the published information in terms of what we're doing with these unit costs of output. Whether or not it may be used as part of the spending review process to actually ration the amounts of money that's going into each of our departments. Even my best friends in Treasury wouldn't tell me, but then they wouldn't, would they? Because clearly if we can say £1 million here will buy you 10 of those, or £1 million there will buy you 5 of these, then we can start to make decisions about which ones we're actually buying with our limited budgets. So that's how the rationing side of it might work. Now, there's a few caveats. There's departments that are primarily delivering policy rather than outputs. So in complete generalisation terms, people like Foreign Commonwealth Office or Cabinet Office or perhaps communities don't actually have perhaps outputs that can be counted. It's going to be quite difficult for them. Accountants know that getting the right costs into the right bundle can be quite interesting as well, because we've got to sort out which costs belong where. Sometimes there's quite a delay between putting money in to our flow chain and the outputs coming out the other end. So if you put extra money into educating the public about how to have a better diet, how long does it take before child obesity as an output starts to go up or down? Right. So there can be quite a problem in a lot of what we do in government. There's cases, obviously, where there can be more than one department contributing to something that's going on. So you've got some of the costs and I've got some of the costs. So how are we going to work out the unit cost if it's in 2 patches? And then there's the inevitable consequence for quality, because we can all reduce the unit costs if we deliver poorer quality outputs. Now, maybe we need to do that. Maybe we can't afford the quality of outputs that we've had before, but we need to know that that's a choice that we're actually making. And that's where we maybe start impinging on the effectiveness, which is going through to the outcomes part of the process. But this is something that's happening, and the first stab of these unit costs have to be with Treasury by the 17th of July. So we don't have months to work on this. We're doing it fairly quickly. So, think back to the TNS and have a think about what you could perhaps do with unit costs that might help you have an idea about whether the money you're spending there is money well spent. So 3 minutes on this bit, please. Right, on your yellow sheets. At this stage, I'd like to hand over to Robert to take you through the Home Office experience.
Valerie, thank you very much, and thank you very much all of you for having me. Not that you particularly had any choice, but you could, of course, depart at this point. I was commenting to Valerie whilst we were waiting to start how struck I was in this room that even though most of us don't know one another, although there are clearly a few familiar faces, Heidi, it's a pleasure to see you. Bob, you and I know one another anyway. Nonetheless, there's a strong sense, at least from the platform, of civil service collegiality amongst the group. So although we may not recognise one another as individuals, we recognise one another as colleagues. So it's very striking to us what that feels like, and there is a sane and rational reason why I'm labouring this point in order to talk about value for money and productivity. Not least, and nobody will believe me, because I have the pleasure of doing what arguably is one of the best jobs in the Home Office. What Valerie asked me to talk about this afternoon, I'll talk for no longer than about 20 minutes, is a story, if you like, about some of the things that we've discovered, both within our department and within our arm's length bodies. So the most familiar of those is the police service, probably, in getting people, managers and staff to think about how to organise themselves differently, how to organise themselves better, and how to secure a much better relationship between inputs, costs on the one hand. We're a baby department. We control about 18 billion of spend a year by comparison with Lee Lewis's humongous, what was it, 170 billion or something? 140. Monstrous amounts of money, it's an outrage. How we convert our baby 18 billion into policing and counter-terrorism work and immigration and passports and some of the things that you're familiar with in our world. And what I'll try to do is to generalise that into some thoughts that you might take away with you. So that's the objective, at least. It's scary times we live in. I've only been able to come to this session today. I'm coming back for a bit tomorrow. It wouldn't surprise me if most of the talk in the sessions has talked about fiscal consolidation. It wouldn't surprise me if quite a lot of the talk in the margins has been a lot of tooth-sucking and shaking of heads. I know for a fact that although the cost to the government, to the civil service of running this whole event is only our staff time and the underpinning staffing infrastructure, the venue is paid for out of sponsorship, that many departments have said they can't afford to send people to this. It's scary times we live in. We will all be aware of that. What I'd like to encourage you to think about today is both the awesome responsibility that that imposes on each of us, and also some of the things that can give us hope. So that's the object of the exercise. The reason for saying awesome responsibility and hope is it's my contention, it's our experience, and it's the experience of many of the departments in this room, that one can do an awful lot in one's own hands with one's own people. There isn't a cavalry in this process. The Treasury isn't going to come with an enormous bag of money and say, we've been deliberately frightening you to death, but actually it's going to be all right. Nor does the current government, in my view, thank God, have any appetite for IT mega projects as the solution to get us out of a very tight fiscal period. Nor is there going to be an enormous army of people from the private sector coming with sort of pre-constructed solutions for us. But there is a cavalry, and the cavalry is all of you, and it's your people. And so the story I'm going to tell you about is our experience of helping our people to do good stuff and to do it with good heart and with good public impact through their own efforts and through their own hands. And then give you some thoughts about actually if the recalcitrant Home Office can do this, and we are, after all, the sort of bad guys, we're with the MOD, the ultimate grudge purchase. If the recalcitrant Home Office can do this, then so can all of you. And what's more, you will be amazed by the insights and the enthusiasm that you can capture from your people. So that's really the point. It's worth just touching on what is it that drives the state's cost. This is a pre-election slide. I don't suppose things have changed all that much in the last several months. And the whole purpose of putting it up is to remind us that almost all of the cost of government is in people. The MOD spends quite a lot on kit, but actually most of its costs are people. And certainly for the rest of us, if you're in the Department for Work and Pensions, you employ large numbers of officials, both at counters and doing caseworking. If you're in our department, you employ large numbers of people sitting at the border or patrolling the streets. If you're the Department for Employment, seeing as Heidi's here, you're not in DFE anymore. Apologies, education. Education was what happened in my head. Employment is what came out of my mouth. If you're in the Department of Education, you employ people helping ministers to design policy, helping ministers to make choices, helping ministers to pass legislation, helping ministers to direct funding. The civil service runs on people. That's where most of the costs are. It's an interesting slide. I think I was kind of expecting a different one. This is one of our slides, though. The point of putting this up is telling you what it is that we've learned in this process. There will be loads of people trying to tell you that doing good VFM is all about tools. And it is a bit. It's about understanding, as Valerie was suggesting, the relationship between what is it we're actually trying to do and the costs and activities associated with getting that to those, and some ways of thinking about that. And in fact, the top right-hand corner, and the idea is just to give you a sense of a map, is the criminal justice system in West Yorkshire. And the sort of interesting thing to note is, my goodness, there are a lot of steps there, aren't there? And what the fuzzy writing carefully hides is the sort of public service failure and waste associated with those steps. So we've learned about tools to understand our system. What we've learned a lot more about is about how actually the critical factor in securing improvements in value for money is thinking about organisational culture and thinking about how we can genuinely capture the insights and the enthusiasm and the energy of the people who work in our organisations. The other thing that we've learned is the truly striking impact that getting this right has on public services. Our ministers, I come from meetings this week where the Home Secretary is being asked to think about, and your Secretaries of State will be doing exactly the same thing, what sorts of trade-off choices might I need to make in preparing my submission to the Treasury later this month? What assumptions can I make about the impacts that doing things differently can have? What's that worth to me in cash? What's it worth to me in performance? The point of this graph, and main departments who've done rigorous value for money and continuous improvement work have similar pictures, is to say you can get step changes in the level and quality of operational outputs and step changes in the unit costs with which you deliver those outputs simply through the diligence and effort of your people. None of the stuff on this picture, and these are all operational policing outputs, how long it takes to detect a crime in Leeds fell from 47 days to 4 days. How on time police in Merseyside are in responding to emergency calls from the public. All of these changes were achieved without kit, without massive upfront expenditure, without organisational restructuring, without legislation, and without sending out best practice guidance from Whitehall and telling the children how to do things differently. So these graphs could come from your organisations too. DWP has done loads of this stuff. The Revenue has, parts of the Ministry of Defence and Forces have, the Ministry of Justice has, capturing the knowledge and the insights of their people in order to change how they work. So direct public benefits from focusing on VFM. Benefits for people like us. I'm with the Treasury people in the room. We're the evildoers in central finance. We make wild assumptions about what's possible. Doing VFM well, this is just an example that I tried to anonymise and then realised that if you could read this properly, you'd see that it says Great Yarmouth, which gives you the hint about whereabouts it is. Doing VFM well enables you to make central planning assumptions as well. It gives you benchmarks. It allows you to do the kinds of unit cost work that Valerie was talking about and think, actually, what is it that drives our costs? What assumptions can we make about how that can change? It also, and these are current data, this is the cost of payments of asylum support, which is a bit like social security benefit, to foreign people in the UK who are claiming asylum here. And the hashed lines are the forecast spending trajectory, and the blue lines are the actuals as a result of my colleagues in the border agency changing their working practices and doing things in a different way. So speeding up the way in which they process applications, speeding up the way in which they turn off support to people who are no longer entitled to it, becoming better at either granting people the right to stay in the UK or, far more often, I'm afraid, putting people on aeroplanes and sending them home. So 3 sets of benefits: direct public service quality benefit, direct cost-saving benefit, and for the central planners amongst us, benchmark and other planning assumption benefits. We also, in the current world, can start to think, actually, what sorts of strategic planning choices can I as an organisation make? How can I save money and then do something with the consequences? But it raises questions, and it also forces us to dispel some myths. The questions are, how do we create the right incentives for our people to do this kind of stuff? Or alternatively, if you're the Home Secretary, Robert, why the hell is it that people aren't doing this already, particularly if we get the kinds of benefits that we're talking about? How can we encourage people to do more of this and not just rely upon the environment to drive people to it? The environment will drive people to taking money away. It won't necessarily drive people to doing things better. How can we draw people's focus onto materiality? It's interesting that your worked example is TNS, which is excellent because we're all so familiar with it. It is interesting that in a main department, I lost a week of my life, give or take, to a lot of argy-bargy about how we can stop people travelling first class on the train. We spend about, in the Home Office, £3.5 million a year on travel and subsistence out of our 18 billion. I honestly really, I mean, Gus would kill me, please can we not record this? I honestly really don't care about travel on trains because it's not material. Materiality is how many police officers do we employ and what do they do? What does the border agency do? And how can we change people's ways of thinking? So this is the sort of killer part of my little bit. You'll remember that I said there's a tendency to think about tools. It's all about understanding a process and mapping it. It's all about scrutinising the relationship between inputs on the one hand and outcomes on the other. It is about those things. But it's also about what we do with that knowledge. And the two self-evident bits are being rigorous in making sure that we understand our business properly and making sure that we do sensible things with the numbers. I mean, I say these things and it's motherhood and apple pie. Everybody's sort of thinking, yes, of course, why doesn't he just get on with it? But I bet that your organisations don't know all that better than mine does, actually, how money is spent, what drives performance, what drives cost. It's also about discipline. It's sticking to the numbers. It's seeing things through. It's not just making choices on the basis of materiality today. It's carrying on doing that every week, every month for the next 4.5 years. And most importantly of all, it's about emotional intelligence. It's about helping the people who work with you to think, why did I join the civil service? Why actually am I here? I'm not especially well paid by comparison with the private sector. The sorts of things that I'm asked to deal with in my job actually can be really quite difficult. A lot of us and a lot of our colleagues deal routinely with difficult members of the public, with horrible, wicked issues that are very hard to sort out and where we keep seeing the same people coming back. The working environment for a lot of our staff isn't especially wonderful. We're worried a bit about what's going to happen to us in the future, what will happen to our pensions, what will happen to our pay. So, why is it we're here? And what is it that civil servants want out of their career? And this is the part that's worth focusing on. It's spending time with our people thinking, what is it we're actually trying to do here? Why did we join up? What are the outcomes our organisation needs? What does the public need of us, particularly during such a difficult time? And then thinking, OK, so if the outcomes that the public needs of us are those, and this is straight back to Vanerie's material, what are the things which honestly produce those outcomes? Do we need to do all the things that we're doing currently? How would we know? Is there a different way of doing things? What do the numbers tell us? How can we get to planning things differently? And how, if I skip back really quickly, don't know where the projector is, it's up there somewhere, how can we get to some assumptions about both improved performance on the one hand and reduce cost on the other, because those two things aren't trade-offs. So the sort of essence of VFM in our hands has been helping our officials to think, what is it I'm actually trying to do? I'm not here just to draw a salary. I don't earn enough to be here just to draw a salary. I'm not here for the good of my health. I'm here because my part of the organisation is helping to protect the border, or my part of the organisation is making sure that people who are out of work get paid properly and on time, or my part of the organisation is helping to make sure that school children actually have schools to go to and books to read. So what is it in our work that actually delivers those things, and how would we know, and how can we avoid doing the things we don't need to do anymore? So for us at least, those three, I should have put a duplicate slide in at the end, we'll do this for tomorrow, those three parts of the FM are equally important. They're like a three-legged stool. Rigour in understanding the numbers, discipline in sticking to it, but actually crucially, most importantly of all, thinking in an emotionally intelligent way, what is it that turns our people on, what do they need of us, how can we help them to think about what it is we're actually trying to do, including when a lot of them will be scared about what's going to happen to them. So that's been our sort of experience of all of this. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Robert. All right. We will concentrate still on the very minutiae of TNS. We've looked at possible ways of analysing what's going on. What I'd now like you to think about is the reaction that people in your organisation may come up with if you propose certain changes. So again, you and your neighbour decide, maybe you're going to, as Robert said, stop all first-class rail travel, or stop all TNS completely, or whatever. Bearing that in mind as a possible suggestion that you may have to come up with, how are we going to take into account the people side of what's going on and think about how they're going to react? So again, 3 minutes with that on your neighbour. Right. Now we'll pause there on the yellow sheets and the TNS. I will touch on it a little bit more in a few minutes, but please take that exercise as a practice skirmish, really, for any cost areas that you might have to look at. Right, it's a reasonable 4 sets of questions to be thinking about, whatever it is you need to think about by of costs. We just picked TNS because it was something hopefully everybody in the room could identify with. In terms of cutting costs, probably most of you are aware that the Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister have asked us, as civil servants, to have our say in terms of what should be changed in what's going on in terms of spending. The website's there, Treasury Gov Spending Challenge. There are some terminals downstairs where you can actually log on and do it there, or do it on bits of paper. You can do it anonymously. You can put your email addresses in. I checked this morning, they'd already had 45,000 suggestions. There's a nice team sorting out all the suggestions. They're looking at every suggestion. They're still welcoming more. So please do put your ideas in, right? Because we know what happens once the public are asked to comment about gilt-plated pension schemes and things like that. There will be other suggestions coming forward. So let's get our suggestions into the process. So please do. Now, I mentioned the information will be available afterwards. So the PowerPoint presentation that we're clicking through now will be available on the website afterwards. Other things that's going to be there. In terms of tools and techniques, no apologies for this. There is a relatively new value for money and reform toolkit that's came out from the Treasury within the last month. And that relates back to those 9 questions. Should we be doing it? Should the private sector be doing it? All those sort of questions. So it's built around there. It gives you some questions to spin off from there in terms of analysing what spending is being done. There's also going to be available the Value for Money toolkit, which we at National School put together, which actually looks at it from the angle of the 3 E's and says, OK, what are the possible ways in which you could improve economy? And gives lots of different techniques and gives examples of where they've been used and caveats where necessary. So those will both be there as a way to get access to more information. Robert's kindly agreed that his continuous improvement checklist, which was a way they diagnosed through what was going on in the Home Office, that has also going to be on there, so you can have a look at that and adapt it as you wish. Treasury announced a review of TNS policy, so that is actually going to be there as well. So you can actually see what the proposals, well, not the proposals, the guidance is at the moment from the Treasury about what all our departments should be doing to review what's happening in terms of spend on TNS. In a vain attempt, given what Robert said earlier, that today is free, I will put you in a link to some of the national schools programs that we run, open or tailored, both in terms of, we've got one in my team on terms of getting more from your budget, we've got more in terms of achieving more with less, but also the other programs that we have. And for free, there is the Finance Skills for All e-learning package, which you can access from a website anywhere. So it's not GSI, it's ordinary internet access. It's got 10 modules that tie in with the professional skills for government requirements. So if you think your background knowledge about finance is a little bit on the skimpy side and you want to patch up, then do use that one as a way to boost those, and please access that. Okay. Now, that's as far as we've got in the materials we wanted to cover. So I'll pause at this point, and we've got some time for questions, either from myself or for Robert. So could I ask the microphone runners and anybody who's got any questions? Any questions, please pop your hands up. And we'll have a go. The lady here in blue.
Elizabeth Watmore, Communities and Local Government. So I'd like to be sneaky and ask 2 questions, please. The first is, do you see a difference between the productivity agenda and VFM agenda? Ministers are saying to us, VFM's old hat, productivity is the thing. So just interested in views on whether there's a difference between the two. The second, Robert, in your really interesting presentation, you talked about how do you increase take-up. If you've got any great ideas, I'd love to hear them.
Right, well, given that Robert's job title is Head of VFM and Productivity, you're probably the best person to comment on the difference between them.
I obviously hesitate to disagree with ministers. No, I don't think there's any difference at all. I think there is a clear focus in the current government's mind on increasing the productivity of the mainstream public services, by which they mean the cost effectiveness of the large battalions of people who deliver services directly to the public. And I think that's why they're using the productivity word. I suspect also they're using it because value for money, nobody really knows what it means, and they need to be reminded endlessly that it's economy, efficiency and effectiveness. So I think there's a sort of complexity point, but I don't think there's a difference, no. How do we increase take-up? I travelled to this event with the Director General for Policing Policy in the Home Office, who is seeing the Home Secretary tonight as one of the series of meetings I talked about earlier. And we had a conversation about incentivisation. And I have to say, one of the things that's kept me going for the last 4 years is anger. I've been furious seeing the opportunities that are available in our organisation to do things better, let alone cheaper, and we haven't been doing it as much as we might have done. I've been thinking, bloody hell, why is it we're not doing more of this? And I think the problem now is going to be increasing the take-up of sensible, sane, rational, well-considered stuff, and trying to minimise the take-up of crazy slash and burn, let's just reduce costs. And the current government doesn't want crazy slash and burn, let's just reduce costs, because that tends to cause problems down the line. I remember in a bit of the government that we used to be involved in, that one of the ways that they saved money was by stopping maintaining capital infrastructure. And without giving too many secrets away, we then had a massive prison refurbishment programme because everything got grotty and then needed repair, and ultimately prisoners get really uppity if the buildings are cold or the water comes in through the roof. So encouraging people to do sensible things is really important. The sorts of things, and this is let me give you a policing specific example. You'll have to generalise for your services. We came to the conclusion that we need to focus on 4 things simultaneously. We need to get to and use numbers quickly and have an expectation of using numbers so that there is a sense of comparative performance and benchmarking and proper understanding of what it is that drives costs, even if actually the knowledge at the moment is a bit flaky. Because the more we expect to see those things, the more that officials and ministers will force themselves actually to understand the relationship between inputs and outcomes. The second thing that we think we will need to do is to refocus the whole of the inspection and audit regime on not just looking for the consequences of having increased productivity, so we're going to give people benchmarks. This is how much good places spend on answering emergency telephone calls from the public or stamping passports, but rather getting the inspection regime to look for the behaviours that take the workforce through the kind of change programme I was describing, in order to pull people in that direction rather than leaving them in a slash and burn place or a let's just email out guidance place. Third thing we're going to try and play with is the incentives that we build into our national training offering on the one hand, and into the sorts of criteria, I'm thinking particularly of the police, the sorts of criteria we use for promotions and senior appointments on the other. So you can see already what we're trying to do is to line up all of the various sets of incentives that bear on people, rather than just being lazy and thinking it's whatever we tell them to do, or it's whatever their performance-related pay tells them to do, but rather how can we make the system pull people in the direction in which we want them to go, rather than us having to push the whole time. And then the final part, and the government's already helping us with this a bit, we need to help them to do it better, is trying to get as much as possible of the language of the government, the language of ministers, the sorts of things they say in speeches, the sorts of things they reward on visits, in alignment with taking the workforce through this kind of change and expecting to see the consequences. So having taken a long time to answer the question, it's thinking what are the various sets of incentives that bear on the workforce, and how can we tweak as many of them as possible to shove the world in the direction we need, rather than relying on the whip and hoping that that will get people. Because the problem with the whip is people comply, at least to begin with, and you tend to get very crazy, perverse consequences. And the moment you stop whipping them, they relax and it stops. Actually, what we've got to do is make it so that it's easier and feels right to do good than not to do good, so that people of their own volition, with their own discretionary effort, pursue BFM.
Thank you. Right, we've probably got time for one more. Does anybody else? Oh, there we are. Thank you.
Alex Gledhill from the Home Office. We mentioned in the presentation how the kind of new spending framework is going to be built around outcomes a lot more, and I suppose that leads me to ask a provocative question, and kind of sharing your sense of anger, Robert, about past opportunities maybe going astray. Do you think that perhaps past kind of financial and performance frameworks for public service delivery have had something of an unhealthy focus on process rather than outcome? Sorry, that's a bit provocative.
No, that's okay. I'll give you my very quick answer from my viewpoint, seeing a lot of departments, because obviously I visit a lot of organisations when I'm running events. The main financial process up to now has been make sure you spend everything in your budget. That has been the primary concern of finance departments and people with budgets. Right, so that's what I've seen. So yes, I'd love to see that changed.
I think, and our department, of course, is in the public eye quite a lot. So there's a temptation to respond to things with initiatives. I think it's very easy, and you haven't blamed ministers, it would be very easy to blame ministers. Oh, they're completely hopeless, they make us do crazy things. My experience of ministers has been they generally aren't like that. They generally want to do good, although they also have a need to demonstrate quite properly to the public that they are doing stuff. If I was going to criticise us and them, I don't think we've been as serious as we might have been at being really clear what the outcome is we're actually trying to achieve, and really honest about what the outcome is that we're trying to achieve. And we kind of try to get to the right answer too quickly, rather than thinking what is it we're actually trying to do here. The times when we've managed to get that right, it's become very much easier for officials and ministers to test against that outcome objective any particular proposition and say, is this facing in the right direction? Is it going to do what we want? And I don't think we've been good enough at doing that, quite frankly. I also think we underestimated very significantly just how powerful an incentive effect performance targets have been. And I think everybody at each layer in the system has spotted just how powerful an incentive they are. And so we've kind of let our enthusiasm for getting people to do what we want run away with us and made the world a bit too complicated. So on the one hand, we've not been clear. Now then, people, these 2 or 3 things are what we're actually trying to do. And we've compounded that difficulty by becoming over keen to use specific measures to guide behaviour, which has tended to infantilise people. If I give Valerie a target, Valerie, you must do your job like this, rather than Valerie, you must deliver this outcome, then I infantilise Valerie. It's then my responsibility to specify how she does her job, rather than it being Valerie's responsibility to work out how to get to the right answer. It takes discretionary choices away. So I think we've got two things wrong.
All right. Okay, well, I will wrap it up there because you've got to get out, dash around, grab a cup of coffee or whatever, and get back into wherever you're heading next. Thank you all for coming. I hope you've enjoyed it. Okay.